There comes a point in every thoughtful life when the questions about existence begin to ache more than they inspire, when the world feels both full and hollow at once, when belief itself seems fragile, yet the hunger for meaning refuses to die. William James lived in that tension. He was not a preacher and not a mystic. He was a psychologist who looked into the heart of religion and saw not dogma, but experience. He saw that faith was not a set of rules, but a pulse that ran through the human mind itself, that something in us longs to reach beyond the visible world, and yet must learn to do so without denying reason or sanity. He called this search the study of the varieties of religious experience, and in that work he found the soul of psychology itself, not in experiments or theories, but in the trembling sincerity of those who have felt touched by something beyond understanding. For James, the soul was not a ghost. Hiding inside us, it was the living thread that tied all our moments of consciousness together. He believed that religion at its best was a way of feeling more alive, more awake to what he called the unseen order of life, the dimension that cannot be measured but can be deeply felt. And he noticed that every person who had truly lived through a religious awakening described the same paradox: an inner light, born in the middle of darkness. He did not try to prove whether God existed in any physical sense. Instead, he asked a deeper question: what happens to the human mind when it believes? And that simple shift made all the difference. It turned religion into a psychological event, an intimate drama between fear and hope, between despair and surrender. He saw people not as believers or skeptics, but as explorers of their own interior world. For some, the word God meant a personal being. For others, it was the feeling of unity with the universe. For others, still, it was the deep intuition that life had meaning beyond the accidents of chance. James refused to pick a side. He said what matters is not the theology, but the transformation that follows. If belief makes a person kinder, braver, or more alive, then it holds truth in its fruits, not in its formulas, and that idea changed the landscape of psychology forever. He dared to say that the mystical and the practical were not enemies. They were two ways of touching the same mystery. Imagine a woman sitting alone in a hospital waiting room at 3 in the morning, her hands shaking her thoughts, spiraling between prayer and panic. She doesn't know if the person she loves will live. She whispers to the ceiling. Not because she is certain of an answer, but because the silence itself becomes unbearable. That quiet plea, that invisible bridge between fear and faith, is what James meant by the soul's cry for connection. He said that moments like this define religion, not the sermons, not the scriptures, but the raw collision of vulnerability and hope. James also warned that modern life makes it harder to listen to that cry. We fill our minds with noise and movement until there is no space for mystery. He called it the divided self, the part of us that wants control and the part that yearns to let go to live well. He believed one must integrate those two selves, the rational and the mystical, the outer and the inner. And this integration was what later thinkers like Jung would echo through the idea of individuation, the process of becoming whole. If you try this tonight, he would say, do not start by trying to believe. Start by observing your own moments of reverence. Notice when you feel most alive. It might be while holding a child, or walking under the night sky, or hearing music that breaks something open inside you. Write one sentence beginning with the words "in this moment." I feel real. That sentence is not a prayer, but a map to the sacred dimension of your own mind. James would call that the pragmatic path to the soul, finding truth, not by doctrine, but by lived experience. For him, psychology was never meant to strip away wonder. It was meant to understand it. He saw no contradiction between science and spirit, because both were attempts to study the depths of being, and he often said that a life is worth living if it can be lived heroically. Even in doubt, religion then was not about escaping uncertainty, but about facing it with courage. It was the art of trusting the unseen order while walking through chaos. And perhaps that is what he meant when he said that faith is the belief that life is worth living, and that belief helps create the fact. And so the question is not whether you have faith, but where your faith quietly hides. Is it in the mind's endless need for certainty, or in the heart's trembling acceptance of mystery? To live like James is to turn toward that question, not with fear but with curiosity, to see that psychology and religion are not opposites, but two languages describing the same human longing to feel whole. Again, when William James looked at the human condition, he saw that our struggles with religion and the soul were not about choosing belief or disbelief. They were about the tension between two forces inside us, the outer self that wants to appear strong and logical, and the inner self that feels fragile and uncertain. He said that most people live caught between these two selves, never allowing them to meet the outer self, builds habits, follows rules and seeks approval, while the inner self whispers of meaning and fear and love, and the need to surrender to something larger than control. When these selves are divided, a person feels restless no matter how successful or admired they appear. There is an invisible ache that no achievement. Keynes James called this the sickness of the divided self, a state where the mind is split between intellect and emotion, between control and surrender. He found that true religious experience was the healing of that split. It was not about joining a church or following doctrine. It was about the mind discovering that the light and the darkness inside it were not enemies but companions. He saw conversion not as sudden magic, but as the slow realization that our weakness and our strength belong to the same soul. When a person finally stops pretending to be unbroken and instead accepts their inner fracture, something changes. There is a quiet release, like exhaling after years of holding one's breath. James said that the person who can live with both their shadow and their light becomes whole, and this echoes what Jung later described as individuation, the journey of reconciling the personal with the shadow to become one authentic being. Think of a man who spends his life chasing success, working late nights, telling himself that meaning will come once he achieves enough. His friends envy him, his parents praise him, but when he comes home to his silent apartment, he feels like a ghost. One evening he stands on his balcony looking over the city lights and feels nothing, just a faint ache in his chest. Then, without knowing why, he begins to cry, not from weakness, but from recognition. It is the first honest thing he has done in years. In that moment he experiences what James would call the birth of the twice-born soul, the moment when the self that was built for the world begins to give way to the self that was waiting in the dark. James wrote that religion at its deepest is not about obedience but transformation. It is the courage to live from the deeper self, even when the outer world cannot understand it. He believed that every human being has the capacity for mystical feeling, not in the supernatural sense, but in the intimate sense of feeling connected to something infinite within ordinary life. The sunrise, the sound of laughter, the small mercy of being forgiven. He wanted people to see that the soul's experiences were not separate from psychology, but the foundation of it. He invited his readers to explore their own consciousness, the way one might explore a hidden room in their house. He said, "Notice the small flickers of meaning that pass through your mind. When you are quiet, those moments of sudden clarity or gratitude that come without reason, do not dismiss them as sentiment. They are clues from what he called the wider self, the part of consciousness that touches the edges of the unseen world." He believed that when we honor these fleeting feelings, we begin to live religiously, not by creed, but by sensitivity. If you want to try this in your own life, James would suggest a small act of reflection. Take 5 minutes before sleeping and write one memory that feels sacred to you, not because it is perfect, but because it made you feel real. It might be the moment you forgave someone, or the day you lost something and learned tenderness instead of anger. Do not analyze it. Just name it. This practice, he would say, helps you recognize the living presence of the soul in your everyday psychology. He also warned that the modern mind resists such tenderness. We hide behind intellect to protect ourselves from the unknown. But James believed that the unknown is where meaning lives. He said that faith begins when we act as if the unseen is real, not by blind belief, but by courageous experiment, to pray, to hope, to love, even when we cannot prove. Why he treated faith not as superstition, but as a hypothesis to be tested through experience. Live as if life has meaning, he would say, and see what follows. That experiment of the heart was his true method. In the end, he saw religion, psychology, and the soul as one continuum of human effort to make sense of existence. The scientist studies the brain, The mystic studies awareness, the philosopher studies truth, but they are all standing around the same fire trying to name the warmth. The danger is when any one of them claims to own the flame. For James, humility was the highest virtue of the soul, the willingness to admit that we know almost nothing yet to live, as if love and meaning are real anyway to him. That was the sacred art of being human. There is a moment in every sincere life when the intellect begins to tire of its own cleverness, when the endless analysis fails to touch the hunger that sits beneath the heart. William James understood this hunger and called it the quest for the more. He saw that human beings are not satisfied with explanations. We want participation. We do not simply want to understand life. We want to feel it vibrating with meaning. That is why he said that religion begins where reasoning ends, not because reason fails, but because it reaches its edge and must hand the torch to experience. He wanted psychology to walk with faith, not against it, for he believed that the mind itself was built to experience the invisible, as if the soul was not a belief, but a sense organ reaching for something it cannot name yet knows is there. To James, the great tragedy of modernity was not disbelief, it was indifference. He saw people drifting through life like sleepwalkers, caught in endless routines, who mistake busyness for purpose and efficiency for peace. He would have looked at our modern lives and seen the same illness magnified: the mind addicted to noise, the body exhausted from striving, and the heart quietly starving beneath the surface. He wrote that the cure for such spiritual fatigue is not withdrawal but awakening. It begins when one realizes that the sacred can be found in the most ordinary acts. If one looks deeply enough, the way morning light touches the floor, the way a child's laughter cuts through silence, or the way a small act of kindness suddenly restores our faith in everything. Imagine a teacher who once loved her work but now feels hollow. She lectures without passion, corrects papers without joy. Every morning she drives to school and feels a growing weight in her chest. One day, a student stays after class and quietly tells her that something she once said changed their life. She cannot remember what she said, but for a moment she feels her heart stir. She goes home and writes in her journal: "Tonight, I remembered that I matter." It is such a small sentence, yet it becomes the beginning of her healing. This is what James meant when he said that the soul is not found in grand beliefs, but in simple awakenings. He believed that the deepest form of religion was the recognition of unseen connections between moments, between people, between inner and outer worlds. When he spoke of the unseen order, he did not mean a distant heaven. He meant the invisible harmony that holds our chaos together. When we stop to listen even briefly, we can feel it, a sense that life, though uncertain, is not meaningless. He described this as the mystical sense, a direct contact with something larger than the personal self. But he insisted that such experiences should never become arrogance. They are not proof of superiority, but invitations to humility. He said that when a person has truly touched the mystical, they do not feel larger but smaller. They feel part of a vast and merciful whole. If you wish to glimpse this unseen order, James would gently suggest a practice not of doctrine but of attention. Tomorrow morning, before reaching for your phone, pause and breathe. Notice the space between thoughts. Listen for the quiet pulse beneath your racing mind. It is the sound of consciousness itself, and if you can sit with it even for a minute, you will touch what he called the stream of consciousness, the living river that carries your sense of self from one moment to the next. By watching that river, you begin to see that the soul is not a fixed object, but a flow. And the more you learn to flow with it, the more you feel at peace. James also believed that suffering had a strange place in the growth of the soul. He did not romanticize pain, but he saw that despair often precedes awakening. He studied people who had fallen into darkness and emerged transformed, not because their pain vanished, but because they discovered meaning inside it. He said that religion gives people a second birth, not by removing suffering, but by changing their relationship to it. Instead of asking, "Why me?" they begin to ask, "What now?" This turning of the question from resistance to participation was to him the heart of spiritual maturity. Think of a man who loses his job after years of loyalty and pride. For months, he feels worthless and angry. Then one morning he begins volunteering at a shelter where people have less than he does. He listens to their stories and feels something shift. He realizes that his worth was never in his title, it was in his capacity to care in that realization. He finds a strange calm. The world has not changed, but his relationship to it has deepened. James would call this the redemption of experience, the point where psychology and religion meet and heal each other. He taught that the soul's purpose is not to escape the world, but to participate in it more fully. When one lives from this awareness, every act becomes sacred. Making tea, paying bills, forgiving a friend, even grieving becomes part of a vast invisible rhythm to live religiously. In his sense is to live awake to that rhythm, not as a saint, but as a human being willing to feel the mystery without needing to solve it. And in that willingness, one finds what James always sought: the quiet joy of being real. William James often said that the greatest discovery of his generation was that a human being can alter their life by altering their attitude of mind. He did not mean this as a slogan, but as a profound recognition of the soul's creative power. For him, consciousness was not a passive mirror reflecting the world. It was an active force shaping it through attention and belief. He noticed that whatever we hold in sustained attention begins to grow real within us, and this was as true for despair as it was for faith: to think nobly, to feel sincerely, to believe courageously. These were acts of creation, not imagination. He believed that when a person directs their inner focus toward the good, the true and the beautiful, even amidst suffering, they participate in building what he called the moral universe. He saw religion as the human effort to stay in touch with that moral universe, a way of remembering that our private struggles belong to a larger story. And psychology, he thought, was the map of that effort to bridge the seen and the unseen, to translate the experiences of the soul into the language of the mind. For him, these were not separate disciplines. They were two ways of describing the same mystery of consciousness. He believed that belief itself is a kind of experiment. When we act as if something is true, the mind begins to organize itself around that truth. This is what he called the will to believe, not blind faith, but courageous participation in possibilities that cannot yet be proven. Consider a young man who feels trapped in emptiness after losing someone he loved. He tells himself that nothing matters anymore, that the universe is indifferent to his pain. Yet one evening, he finds himself standing in the rain, watching how the drops gather on the leaves, and he feels a strange tenderness rise within him. It does not erase his grief, but softens it. He begins to suspect that perhaps life has beauty, even without his consent. He decides that tomorrow he will try to live as if meaning might still exist, even if he cannot see it. That small decision changes him more than he expects. Over time, his numbness begins to thaw, not because proof appeared, but because his belief created space for life to return. James said that faith is a leap of the heart, not a demand for certainty. It is the courage to move forward while still trembling, and this applies not only to religion, but to every human choice. Every time we love, forgive, or begin again, we are acting as if unseen goodness is real. He believed that the universe responds to such faith with its own echo, a subtle harmony that guides us, though we may not recognize it at once. This is why he said that religion, at its best, gives a person a new center of energy, an inner orientation that allows them to face chaos with calm. He invited people to become explorers of their own inner weather. He asked them to notice how moods shift, how despair darkens, and how hope suddenly returns without warning. He wanted psychology to pay attention to these invisible tides, because they reveal how consciousness and the unseen order interact. He believed that when we cultivate awareness of our inner life, we begin to participate in a greater intelligence that runs through all things, and he said that this participation is the closest we can come to touching the divine, not through dogma, but through presence. If you wish to practice this awareness, he might tell you to choose one ordinary activity each day and treat it as sacred. When you drink your morning tea, pay attention to the warmth on your hands, the scent rising from the cup, the rhythm of your breathing. In that stillness, notice how the mind softens, how thought begins to quiet. What you are feeling in that moment is not mystical fantasy, it is the soul remembering itself. James believed that the sacred hides in the ordinary, waiting for us to notice. He also warned that the danger of modern life is spiritual laziness, the tendency, to live by default to assume that meaning must come from outside us, from systems or leaders or entertainment. He said that a person who waits for proof of meaning will wait forever, while the one who dares to act as if life is meaningful begins to make it. So this was the essence of his philosophy, the idea that reality is shaped not only by what we see but by what we are willing to affirm. He believed that the soul thrives when it lives from choice, not from reaction. And so when we speak of religion, psychology, and the soul, we are not speaking of three separate paths. We are speaking of one continuous human effort to wake up in a world that constantly tries to lull us back to sleep, to live, like James, is to practice faith, not as blind devotion, but as intelligent surrender, a way of saying yes to the mystery of being alive, even when the answer is unclear, and when that yes becomes a daily rhythm, something quiet and radiant begins to move through the cracks of ordinary days. And life once again feels like a conversation between the visible and the unseen. William James always returned to one central idea, that the deepest truth of life is not found in theories, but in experience. He wanted us to look directly at the way life feels when we are fully present to it, the way sorrow can deepen compassion, and how wonder can return in a single breath. He said that the soul is not somewhere else waiting to be found. It is the living awareness behind every moment it speaks. When the mind is quiet and listens, when the heart softens to him, religion was not a system to believe in, but a way of feeling connected to something immense, tender and intelligent that flows through all things. He would look at the modern world and see people racing toward distraction, afraid of stillness yet desperate for meaning. He would tell us that the answer is already within us, that the same consciousness which studies the stars also beats inside the human heart when you pause and feel that pulse. You are touching what he called that invisible expansion of being, which turns ordinary existence into something luminous. He would say that to live spiritually is not to escape the world, but to meet it with a heart that can bear both its beauty and its pain. He believed that the proof of any faith is its fruits. If it makes you kinder, more awake, more patient, then it holds truth, regardless of creed or label. He saw the spiritual life as an experiment in love, an ongoing dialogue between the finite and the infinite, and he urged us to keep the dialogue alive, not through arguments, but through attention, through small daily acts of reverence, a walk taken slowly, a word spoken gently, a silence kept honestly. These are the ways the soul remembers itself, and in that remembrance the mind grows calm, the heart grows wide, and the world begins to feel like home again. So perhaps tonight, as you lie awake thinking about your choices, your fears, your small victories, and silent regrets, you can take one breath and whisper inwardly, I am part of something vast. You do not have to name it or prove it. You only have to feel the quiet truth that your life matters, that your attention, your kindness, your courage to keep seeking are the real language of the soul. William James would say that this simple act of awareness is enough to begin the work of a lifetime. And now, if his ideas have stirred something in you, take a moment to reflect in the comments below. What do you think the soul means in your own life? And if you wish to explore these reflections more deeply, you can download the free one-page worksheet linked below. It will gently guide you to write your own small experiences of faith and awareness, not as belief but as lived truth. Let this be your experiment in meaning your personal dialogue with the unseen order. The soul does not demand perfection. It only asks that we stay awake to its presence and live with humility, courage, and tenderness. That is the quiet heroism of being human, and in the end that is what William James devoted his life to understanding the end.